So did you ever find the perfect recipe for a 5-gallon batch of beer, but you wanted a 2.5-gallon batch of beer? Or maybe just a 1-gallon batch of beer? Well, I just went through those steps. So Tree House Brewing put out a great looking recipe for a 5-gallon batch of a stout. Well, I wanted a 2.5-gallon batch. So I took their recipe and scaled it down. Sometimes adapting commercial recipes to your equipment, process, and batch size is not always straightforward. Well, come along as I walk you through my process. Well, thanks a ton for stopping by Cascades Homebrew. My name is Brent. So I've been brewing beer for over 30 years. In that time, I've brewed several published recipes. Sometimes, like I said, taking a published recipe and adapting your process, sometimes there can be confusion. What do I do for the ingredients that I can't get a hold of? What about if I want to tweak the batch size a little bit? How do I fit it to my process and my efficiency? Well, a few years ago, I really fell in love with brewing 2.5-gallon batches, so around 10 liters. Those are about half of a standard size batch. Well, if I want to find a recipe for that size batch, I'm pretty much never going to find them. There are some recipes out there, say for like 1-gallon batches. There's a lot of recipes out there, say like for 5-gallon batches. But if I want to do a 2.5-gallon batch, I'm either going to have to come up with my own recipe or take a published recipe and scale it down. There's several reasons you may need to adopt a published recipe, something you found maybe either in a kit, a magazine, or in a book. Say you found an award-winning recipe, but the brewer brewed a 12-gallon batch. Maybe you want to only brew 5 gallons, or maybe you find 5-gallon recipes and you want to brew that either a bigger or a smaller batch. So one of the big reasons to adapt recipes and scale them is for batch size. But the reality is, even if you're brewing the same size batch, you still may need to scale it. So what is batch size? What is your definition of batch size? So a lot of people have different definitions of what they mean by batch size. So I often call my recipes 5-gallon batches. In that case, I'm looking for 5 gallons into a keg. So for me, that usually means 5.5 gallons of beer into the fermenter, which then probably is closer to 6 gallons at the end of the boil. So some people use batch size to mean the amount at the end of the boil. Some people mean it's the amount into the fermenter. And then some people, kind of like me, at least informally, I use it to reference the amount that I want to get packaged. I'd also note, some people, even though they're maybe getting 5.5 gallons in the fermenter, may plan on a lot more loss in their kettle just so they can get really clear wort. So you have to make sure you're taking stuff like that into account when you're looking at a recipe and converting it to your batch size. So do you understand the efficiency of your process, what to expect? So if you're looking at a recipe, does it list the efficiency? If so, does that efficiency match up with yours? So if the efficiency of the recipe is not listed, do you know how to adapt the recipe to make sure you're getting about the same original gravity and kind of getting that same ABV target range? So you may need to adapt the recipe for your efficiency. So I'm not going to get too deep into efficiency and calculating efficiency. So efficiency, especially mash efficiency, is more of a concern for all grain brewers, but efficiency does impact extract brewers as well, especially if we're talking losses downstream. Say if you have a pump in your system, say how much do you leave behind in the kettle. Those type of things will impact the efficiency of both all grain and extract brewers. So often for all grain recipes or kits, they're often around say a 70%, 75% overall efficiency. But that can vary from source to source. So if you don't take that recipe and adapt it for your efficiency, you might come either high or low on gravity and ABV. So recipes will often have process-specific instructions. Say, sparge with 3 gallons of water. Well, what if you're a brew-in-the-bag brewer and you're typically doing full volume mash? Do you really need to sparge with 3 gallons, or can you adapt it to your process? What if the recipe calls for maybe a different dry hop process than what you normally have success with? So should you only brew recipes that fit your exact process? Well, I'd say no. Sometimes you have to adapt a recipe to fit your process. So I will admit, sometimes it is hard to pick out a recipe. What are the brewer's process specific steps, and what are the things that are core to that recipe? Say if a recipe calls for a step mash and you really don't have a system to set up a step mash, how close will the beer be? So what if the recipe calls for a different fermentation temperature than you're able to maintain? Can you still go ahead and brew the beer, or will it be very different? Sometimes you just need to let experience guide that and know how you can adapt recipes and know how they'll turn out. So what if a recipe calls for German Pilsner and you have some Belgian Pilsner or American Pilsner? Can you substitute that instead? What if the recipe calls for a specific hop or yeast that you don't have access to? Are there substitutions you can use? Or do you have to scrap the whole recipe and find one with only the specific ingredients that you have available to you? So sometimes you have to adapt a recipe to the specific ingredients that you have available, or maybe just the ingredients you have on hand. There's often a bit of ambiguity in grain bills in recipes. They usually don't mention the specific maltster. There's some grains, like a chocolate malt or a Munich malt. There's a wide range of color of those different malts. And when we look at yeast, there's several different yeast manufacturers. You would probably find a table that shows yeast substitute from one manufacturer to the other, but the reality is there's usually subtle differences between different yeast manufacturers. And then if you look at liquid versus dry, I usually don't find there's a really good one-to-one mapping between any liquid strains and dry strains. So the reality is you're almost never going to have the exact same ingredients that the recipe and the brewer use, so you're going to have to use your experience to make substitutions. Alright, so that's enough generalities. Let's talk into some specifics. So Nate from Tree House Brewing put out a great video talking about a stout recipe. It's kind of a framework for maybe a stout similar to what they may brew, so that looked great. The recipe was basically a 5-gallon. I wanted a 2.5-gallon batch, so I had to scale it down. And then also, I had some substitutions for ingredients, kind of what I had on hand and what I wanted to use. And then I also had to adapt it to fit my process. So let's walk through the specifics of that recipe. So as we get in, first thing I would say, if you want to do scaling recipes, I really recommend you find some brewing software that fits your needs and your budget. So personally, I use Beersmith, specifically the web version. I really like it, it fits my needs, but I know there's a lot of other software out there that people like using. So I'm going to show a couple screenshots from Beersmith, but other software should have similar features, and I'm not doing really a deep dive into any Beersmith specific features. So whatever software you use, the general process that I'm talking about should apply. Alright, so hang with me here. The first step gets in a little bit in the weeds and some details here. So I'm not going to go really in depth, but generally brewing software will capture process specific information in maybe some kind of a profile. In this case at Beersmith, it's your equipment profile. So that's going to define some important values for the batch. So the most important values for what we're going to talk about today are efficiency, also known as overall efficiency or brew house efficiency. In my case, I have it set to 75%. The other one is batch volume. So with Beersmith, that's the volume into the fermenter, which I have set for 2.7 gallons. So the idea is that I would get about 2.5 into a keg. I actually usually get a little bit less than that. Also an important factor is boil time. In this case, I'm going to use a 60-minute boil. So I recommend with whatever brewing software you use that you understand some of those process-specific variables. So if you're using Beersmith, I know Brad Smith put out some pretty good videos that talk about some of these dialogues with Beersmith. I also want to point out, don't just use all the default values. It's a good place to start, but you want to make sure you're measuring and you're changing your profile to match your exact system and your process. So with that out of the way, let's start looking at the fun stuff. Looking at adding grain, adding hops, picking our yeast. So it makes sense to start off with a recipe's grain bill. So when you look at a published recipe, they often present the grain bill either as a percentage or as an amount. So a recipe could say use 80% pale malt, or it could say use 10 pounds of pale malt. So percentage is often easier to use when you're trying to scale a recipe. So clearly the amount's useful when you're buying the grain and measuring it out. But percentage is often very useful when you're trying to scale it. The recipe doesn't give a percentage. You could calculate the percentage just based on the amounts that are given. So additional information that's useful when scaling a grain bill include the target gravity, the target ABV, and then also the recipe's efficiency. So the Treehouse specific recipe, it didn't give a efficiency and it didn't give a target original gravity. They did give a recipe that had both the amounts and the percentages for the grain, and they also provided a rough range in ABV. Nate said 5.5 to 7% ABV was the target. So as I mentioned, as far as batch size, I wanted to do a 2.5-gallon batch. The recipe was given as a 5-gallon batch, and I think that means 5 gallons of finished product into packaging. And this is something I often see asked, how do I scale a recipe down? Well, it's actually really easy. The easiest way is just really kind of either divide or multiply the amounts to meet your batch size. So looking at some specific examples, if we had a 5-gallon batch and we wanted to convert that to a 1-gallon batch, and we wanted to say the recipe originally called for 10 pounds of one ingredient, well, 1/5 of that, or 20%, that would be 2 pounds. So that's pretty easy. In the case where you have a 5-gallon recipe and you want to convert that to 2.5 gallons, same thing. You have 10 pounds of grain. You want to convert that in half, or 50%, so that's going to be 5 pounds of grain. And then if you want to scale a recipe up, so you have that same 5-gallon recipe, you want to convert it to a 10-gallon recipe. In that case, you take that 10 pounds, you multiply that by 200% this time, and that's going to give you 20 pounds of grain. So I apologize for everybody that uses kind of sane measurement systems out there. I think in pounds and gallons, but for this particular what we're doing here, really it's more just the amounts. 5 to 10, 5 to 2.5, that's more important than the specific. But this was the general approach I took. So they gave a recipe with amounts. I basically took the amounts that were given, divided those in half, and started those off with my grain bill. And then I would see from there if I need to make adjustments. So plug in this specific grain amount using 50% of the amount listed gave me the following grain bill. So note, Beersmith has several different chocolate malts, roasted barley entries from different maltsters. They have different colors. So in this case, I just kind of picked some generic values. As I get into it, I probably have to change those for the specific maltster that I'm using in the specific color. So one question you might have trying to scale a recipe is what style are we actually brewing? So the Tree House recipe is called a stout. Well, if you look in Beersmith, there's actually a bunch of different stouts listed. So for this recipe, I go ahead and pick American Stout. As we see as we get into it, the values don't really line up very well with an American Stout, but it's good enough for what we're doing here. So the initial stats puts this recipe just above the American Stout as far as the original gravity, color, and ABV. We don't have any hops yet, so the IBUs are at 0. So I go ahead and select a mash temperature of 154 degrees Fahrenheit. That'd be 68 degrees Celsius. That was one of the recommendations in the video. So I haven't selected a yeast yet, but the predicted ABV at this point is 7.1%. So at this point, I have a decision to make. Do I want to scale the recipe back to lower original gravity, get a lower ABV, or do I want to go with what I've got here so far? I kind of figure a 7% stout sounds pretty good. So we're going to move forward with that, and we'll make some adjustments down the road if we need. So now it's time to add on our hops. So hops provide both bitterness and then flavor and aroma. Bitterness is easier to calculate and is expressed as IBUs. Unfortunately, there's not really a measurement or way to express hop flavors and hop aroma. But in general, early boil additions, they're going to add more of that bitterness. Late hops, or if you're doing dry hop, we're not dry hopping here, that's going to give you more of that flavor and the aroma. So I generally concentrate on the IBUs for those initial bittering additions. For the late ones, I'm looking more for the amount. I think the amount's going to give you that flavor. Definitely bitterness from late boil additions can definitely impact it. So sometimes, especially if you're using high alpha acid hops, you need to account for the bitterness that you're going to get from those late ones. So it's kind of a combination of bitterness and the amount for some of those late boil hops. So hop additions are usually much more complicated, say for like an IPA hoppy beers. So in this case, we're brewing a stout. Stouts typically have a pretty simple hopping schedule. So if you look at like potential late bitterness hops, looking at the recipe, Nate says, if you'd like a little bit of hop character, you can add some UK Goldings at 10 minutes for taste. Said, but I prefer to not do this as it muddles the roasted flavors. So based on that recommendation, I didn't go with a late hop addition. So if I did a 10-minute addition, I'd probably do like a half an ounce, maybe like 10 grams of Goldings for this 2.5 gallon batch. I would note that in the video, they kind of said a 25 to 35 IBU list. So since that gravity was kind of high, I went for the 35 IBUs of Warrior. So using Beersmith to calculate that, it says I need 0.37 ounces of Warrior to get those 35 IBUs. Yeah, grams is a little easier to express in these small amounts. So I would note, looking at the comparison to American Stout, that puts us really at the low end of the bitterness. I thought about jacking up the IBUs a little bit, but at this point I put my faith in Nate. He knows how to brew a stout, right? So the next decision to make is yeast. So in the video, they recommend a neutral American ale yeast, like US-05 or one of the Chico strains. So I've been using mostly dry yeast lately, so US-05 is my choice here. So plugging that in will update the attenuation value. So looking at what this calculated a final gravity of 1018, that would give me an ABV of 7.4. So that 7.4% value, that's maybe a little bit higher than what I initially was targeting, but it sounds pretty good. And like I said, I might come in lower on my gravity, and sometimes the final gravity, it's pretty hard for software to predict accurately. So I don't put a lot of faith in that specific number. So I've got a good core recipe here. But to actually brew this, I'm going to need to substitute a few ingredients for what I have on hand, so I don't have to specifically go out and buy specific malts. So I've got the Maris Otter on hand. I've also got a very similar Munich malt, so we're good to go there. I don't have any Crystal 60 on hand, but I do have Crystal 40, so I think that's going to be good enough for us. So looking at those roasted barley and chocolate malts, again, there's a lot of variation in those grains. So if we're looking at my recipe, I'm using a 480 Lovibond roasted barley. And I also have a dark chocolate malt from Brew. The recipe calls for Carafa 3 I don't have Carafa 3 on hand, but I do have some Carafa 2, and I think that's going to get me close enough. So I go for that. So Carafa 2, it's a little bit lighter in color, but then I'm using fairly dark roasted barley and chocolate malts. So I think hopefully they're going to balance out. So what about the water for this one? So water is a very important aspect of a beer, but it can be kind of complex. So I'm not going to go in a lot of details here. I might put out a water video talking about what I do for water, but looking at the recipe, it was pretty vague. It kind of said brewer's choice as far as the water. There was a note to try to make sure you keep your pH in check. So based on starting with my tap water, so I decided to add 1 gram of gypsum, 2 grams of calcium chloride, and then also 1 gram of baking soda. So those additions should, 1, get my calcium up to a good level, give me a little boost of both sulfate and chloride, with a little more chloride to kind of help the mouthfeel. So I'm adding a little bit of baking soda, or sodium bicarbonate. So the bicarbonate is going to help buffer pH changes. So dark grains can be fairly acidic. So I usually have to add a little bit of bicarbonate. In my case, I usually use baking soda, which adds a little bit of sodium. And that helps buffer out the pH and keep the pH up in a decent range. So the specific water additions you may need, it's going to vary a lot based on your tap water or what you're using, say like RO or distilled. So there we are. There's the basics for a Tree House recipe. And I already brewed it. Oh, wait a minute. That's water. So let's try that again. And I already brewed it. And there it is. So there's the beer. So it's still pretty young. It's just in the keg. It's just kind of just getting fully carbonated. So I need to get to work on my next video talking about the brew day, coming back and evaluating this beer, see how it turned out. So if you're interested in that video, once it's out, make sure you click on that. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe to my channel so you get notifications on my other great brewing content. Cheers!